Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to Pod Theory. I am your host, Jason Cercone, and today I'm going to share 4 ways that you can avoid podfade. So, what the hell is podfade? The actual act or the definition of the term is pretty much why I started Pod Theory in the first place, and why I shifted my business focus to helping professionals create better podcasts. But I didn't know it had an actual name until I was doing some research recently. So let's talk about it. Pod fading is when your show stops with no notice. You're producing content one week, and then no one ever hears from you again. It's basically like a TV show that you're really into stopping abruptly with no notice. The show isn't getting the viewers the network expected, and even though you're thoroughly invested in what's happening, the show gets yanked from the rotation, and that's it. No intentional ending, no season ending cliffhanger, just poof, gone. We see this in podcasting all the time. New shows get launched, content rolls out consistently for a bit, then everything starts to taper off. Every week releases become every other week or every 3 weeks, or shows get released with no consistency whatsoever, meaning your listeners have no idea when to expect fresh offerings. Now, there are examples of podcasts that are designed to end at a certain point. If you build a podcast that's designed to be 8 episodes and you express this throughout the series, then your audience will expect your podcast to end after the 8th episode. Likewise, if you do a limited series podcast like Serial, which told the story from beginning to end, a listener knows this content has reached its conclusion, and new content won't be released until the new season begins. As long as you clearly express what's happening with your show, such as a season finale, or even letting your listeners know that you'll be taking a brief hiatus, you're not pod fading. But if you end episode 13 with "see you next week, guys," and then your audience never hears from you again, that's pod fading. Now, there are a number of reasons why a podcast may fade away, and many of them have been discussed on past episodes of Pod Theory, so this may seem redundant. But let's review anyway. A podcast gets started without a plan, and all the long-term details of the show's evolution are not hashed out, therefore, pod fade. The hosts and producers of the show run out of content, and the show fades away. The hosts and producers lose interest in their show, or the hosts and producers don't realize how much work is involved with creating a podcast. The results aren't immediate, therefore the podcast is abandoned because it's quote-unquote not working. Other priorities move to the front line. A major life event takes precedence over producing a podcast. All of these items and others that I'm not mentioning can lead to pod fading. Your podcast can be your chief content strategy if you approach it properly. Just like any content strategy you've rolled out for your brand in the past, you need to have a roadmap. You need to define why you're doing it. You need to set goals and expectations on what your strategy will bring you. In other words, you need to set yourself up for success so you don't suffer from pod fade before your show gains any traction. Here are 4 ways you can avoid pod fade and keep your show going strong. Number 1, develop a plan. I've talked about this on many episodes of Pod Theory so far, and guess what? I'll be talking about it on many more going forward. Because if you're failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. Building a foundational plan that helps you define your why and understand how you're going to market your show and how much time you can dedicate to your efforts each week and other critical aspects that make up your podcast will put you in a great position for longevity with your show. Starting a podcast with no clear direction is a guaranteed surefire way to experience pod fade at some point in the near future. Quick plug. Visit jasoncercone.com/podcastprimer and pick up my 1-page podcast primer to help you get the ball rolling with developing your plan. Plug over. Number 2, build your content around a subject that you could talk about even if no one was listening. If you're developing a brand podcast, the bulk of your content will be centered around your industry. That doesn't mean you can't mix in some topical conversation to add life to the conversation, but ultimately, you want to be sure your content is serving the purpose it's designed to. Chances are, if you're passionate about your brand and your industry, you could talk about it for hours and hours on end, even if you were the only person in the room. That's what makes a podcast the ultimate content vehicle for a brand. The podcasts that experience Podfade are the ones where hosts and producers lose passion for their subject matter. When this happens, staying engaged becomes less and less of a priority, and it's only a matter of time until it becomes no priority at all. Number 3, build your optimal listener profile. What does the perfect listener for your podcast look like? Who is your content catering to? Whose problems are you trying to solve with your podcast? Who do you want to listen to your podcast that will foster a deeper connection with your brand? All of these questions and more will help you develop your optimal listener profile, which is a sketch that digs deep into the psychological makeup of your listener. The more you focus on building this profile, the deeper you can connect with your listeners. The deeper the connection, the more engaged they'll be, and you'll be. And the more engagement you have, the more motivation you'll have to continue producing quality content through your podcast. And number 4, launch your podcast with multiple episodes. Listen, it's an unfortunate fact. Many podcasts you find have one episode that was released 2 or 3 years ago and then nothing. Many mistakes could have been made here. The podcaster just wanted to get something out there and had nothing to follow up with. Or they put their episode out and realized, damn, this is a lot of work, and they threw in the towel. Or maybe they didn't have thousands of listeners beat down their door to listen to their episode, and they felt continuing to produce shows wouldn't be worth it. Maybe it was a combination of all these things, who knows? If you jump back in the Pod Theory archives to episode 13, you'll discover info about developing a launch strategy for your podcast and releasing your first episodes onto the world with excitement and fanfare. Jump back and listen to that when you're done here. But putting out multiple episodes to launch your show has many advantages. It's more content to get listeners hooked, provides more opportunities to pick up some reviews. It's a celebration of sorts that your podcast has arrived. And, as is our theme today, you can knock Podfade down a peg or two right out of the gates. Of course, you could still find yourself battling Podfade down the road, but a successful launch with multiple episodes will get you past that one episode and done barrier immediately, and provide you with early feedback to motivate you to keep going. Podfade can be an ugly thing, and it'll get the best of you if you let it. Keep your focus on quality content, engaging with your audience, developing that deep connection with each listener, and knowing exactly who you're serving your content to through your podcast. When you do this, Podfade will become nothing more than a term you heard applied to someone else's podcast. And that's it for episode 58 of Pod Theory. I had mentioned a couple episodes back that I was working on some things to help you with your podcast development. And one of those things is a new Facebook group called the Podcaster Syndicate. This newly launched group is designed to provide guidance, support, and a worthwhile networking space for podcasters and content creators looking to establish a podcast. If you fall into this category, I welcome you to join me at facebook.com/groups/Podcaster Syndicate. I'm going to post a link in the show notes so you can get easy access to join us on Facebook. Good talk. I'll see you back here tomorrow. This has been Jason Cercone on Pod Theory.